I never really believed in love at first sight, but when I saw Daniel's profile on the app, something about him just felt different, like the universe had aligned just right to put him in front of me at the exact moment I needed him most. His pictures weren't the usual overfiltered gym selfies or grainy mirror shots I had grown used to swiping past. No, his were warm, inviting, like someone had captured him mid-laugh in soft afternoon light, the kind of photos that made you want to know the story behind them. His bio was simple but thoughtful, a little dry humor, a little vulnerability, and just enough mystery to make me want to keep talking, to pull the layers back and see what was underneath. From the very first message, it was like we had known each other forever, like he had somehow already memorized the way my mind worked, responding with exactly the right words, never awkward, never forced, always knowing when to joke, when to listen, when to tease just enough to make me blush even though he wasn't there to see it. The first few days I told myself it was just another app flirtation, something fun to fill the empty spaces between work and sleep, another name I'd forget in a week, but Daniel was different in a way that made me feel it somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. He paid attention to things most people didn't, little details I barely remembered mentioning, like the way I hated the sound of metal scraping against ceramic or how I had a habit of twisting my ring when I was nervous, things no one else had ever cared enough to notice. I would wake up to messages from him, always something sweet, something that made me feel like he had been thinking about me even when we weren't talking, something that made me check my phone too often hoping to see his name. It didn't even feel strange when he said he didn't like video calls or that he wasn't big on taking selfies because everything else felt so real, so natural, and I had already started to picture him in my life in a way that was dangerous, in a way that made it feel like maybe this time, maybe this one would be different. But then there were the moments, the tiny, barely noticeable moments, where something didn't quite fit, little things that made my stomach clench with a flicker of doubt before I pushed it away, telling myself I was just overthinking it. The first time was when he referenced a conversation we had never actually had, bringing up a childhood story I was sure I had never told him, but somehow feeling so confident, so sure, that I started to wonder if maybe I had and just forgotten. Then there was the way he always seemed to know what I was doing, slipping little comments into our chats that lined up too perfectly with where I had been that day. Almost like he had been there too, almost like he had been watching. And then of course there was the night I woke up, disoriented, groggy, with my phone vibrating in my hand and a missed call from him at exactly 3:13 a.m. Only when I played the voicemail, there was no voice, no words, nothing but the sound of breathing, slow and steady and so close to the speaker that I could hear the wetness in each inhale, hear the faintest whisper of my name just before the line went dead. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just a glitch, some weird pocket dial or a mistake with the app, but no matter how many times I replayed the voicemail, there was no mistaking the way my name had been whispered, soft and deliberate, like someone was standing just behind me, close enough that I should have felt the warmth of their breath on my skin. I didn't bring it up to Daniel right away, mostly because I didn't want to sound like some paranoid lunatic, but also because a small stubborn part of me didn't want to admit that something felt off, that the perfect connection I thought I had found might have something lurking just beneath the surface. The next morning, when I casually mentioned that I had fallen asleep early and had a weird dream, he responded almost immediately, telling me in that same easy, effortless way that he had been thinking about me all night, that he had felt this strange pull toward me, like he had been right there in the room, watching over me while I slept. I laughed it off, made some flirty joke about him being my guardian angel, but the words left a strange taste in my mouth, something sour, something that made my skin prickle even though there was nothing inherently wrong with what he had said. When I told Natalie about it later, she rolled her eyes and told me I was being stupid, told me I was getting too attached to a guy I had never even met, but when I let her listen to the voicemail, when she pressed my phone to her ear and her expression shifted from amused to something tighter, something uneasy, I knew I wasn't crazy. She told me to stop talking to him, said it was probably some creepy catfish or some psycho who had figured out my number, but the idea of cutting him off made my chest tighten, made my hands shake in a way that felt more like withdrawal than fear, because by then, Daniel wasn't just some guy on a screen anymore. He was part of my day, part of my thoughts, woven into the fabric of my life in a way I hadn't even realized until the idea of losing him made me feel hollow. So I stayed, ignoring the creeping sense of unease that settled in the back of my mind, ignoring the way Natalie looked at me like I was walking straight into traffic with my eyes closed, ignoring the way his messages started feeling just a little too precise, like he was inside my head, answering questions I hadn't even asked yet. I told myself that no one could fake the way he made me feel, that no one could be that patient, that thoughtful, that perfect if they didn't mean it. But then on a cold, gray afternoon when I was walking home from work, he sent me a message that made my breath catch in my throat, my hands clench around my phone with a grip so tight it made my knuckles ache. "You look beautiful today in that black sweater, by the way." I stopped in my tracks, my pulse hammering so loudly in my ears I almost didn't hear Natalie's voice beside me, asking what was wrong, but when I turned to her my stomach dropped straight through the pavement because I wasn't wearing a black sweater. I was wearing a navy one, almost black but not quite, and I hadn't posted any pictures, hadn't mentioned what I was wearing, hadn't done anything to let him know. So how the hell did he? I should have walked away then, should have listened to that primal instinctive fear curling like smoke in the back of my mind, but instead I did the thing that every stupid girl in every horror movie does. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that there was some logical explanation, that maybe he had seen an old photo or maybe I had mentioned that I liked dark colors once and he was just making an educated guess. But even as I typed out a casual response, even as I forced myself to play along, there was a tightening in my chest that I couldn't quite shake. A feeling like something had just reached through the screen and wrapped cold fingers around my throat. That night I barely slept, my phone sitting on my nightstand like a loaded gun, buzzing every so often with messages from him, all sweet, all normal, all exactly the kind of thing I had once wanted to hear. And yet each one made my stomach twist in knots, made my skin crawl like something invisible was pressing against me in the dark. By the time morning came I had made up my mind. I was going to find out who he really was going to dig up every last piece of information I could, was going to put an end to the gnawing unease before it consumed me whole. I didn't tell Natalie what I was doing because I already knew what she would say, already knew she would try to stop me, would tell me to block him, delete the app, move on like a normal person, but I needed to know. It didn't take long to find his number listed under a local area code, and within minutes I had traced it back to an address, a house about 30 minutes from my apartment, an old Victorian in a part of town I had never been to, a place that looked almost too perfect, too picturesque, the kind of house you see on postcards, the kind that makes you think of warm light and quiet nights, and the kind of life I had started to imagine with him. But as I pulled up to the curb, the illusion shattered like glass, because the house wasn't warm, wasn't lived in, wasn't anything like I had pictured. It was abandoned. The front porch sagged, the windows were caked in dust, and the whole place had that heavy, breathless stillness that only comes from a house that has been empty for a very, very long time. I sat there in my car for what felt like forever, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached, staring at the peeling paint, the rotting wood, the unmistakable wrongness of it, and yet, despite every screaming instinct in my body telling me to turn around and leave, I found myself stepping out of the car, walking up those splintered steps, pressing my fingers to the tarnished brass doorknob. The moment I touched it, something shifted. Not outside, not in the air around me, but somewhere deeper, somewhere inside, like I had just crossed an invisible threshold, like something had just noticed me for the very first time. And then before I could even think, before I could stop myself, I turned the knob and pushed the door open, stepping inside Daniel's house. Even though I already knew that no one was waiting for me inside. The air inside was thick, stale, the kind of suffocating stillness that comes from years of dust settling undisturbed, from a house that has not heard a human breath in a very, very long time. And yet as I stepped inside, as the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here just moments before me, that if I listened closely enough, I would hear the echo of footsteps fading into the walls. The living room was frozen in time, furniture draped in white sheets, corners swallowed by shadows that seemed darker than they should have been, stretching just a little too far, but it was the table in the center of the room that made my skin prickle, made my breath stutter in my throat, because it wasn't covered in dust like everything else. No, the surface was clean, disturbingly so, and on top of it sat a small, neatly wrapped package with my name written across it in familiar handwriting. I should have left then, should have turned around and run, should have ignored the way my fingers trembled as I reached for the package, but my body moved on its own, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pulled at the edges of the paper, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts as I lifted the lid of the box and stared down at the object inside. A phone identical to mine, the screen already unlocked, open to a dating app profile that wasn't mine, but was me. My pictures, my name, my details, everything copied exactly down to the last word, but the location listed beneath it made my stomach drop, made the blood drain from my face because it didn't say my city, didn't say anywhere I had ever been before, it just said here. My hands went ice cold, a deep hollow chill sinking into my bones, and that was when I saw it, the thing I had somehow missed when I first stepped inside. The thing that had been waiting in the dark, watching, surrounding me completely. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them, maybe even hundreds, arranged in neat, careful rows, stretching from floor to ceiling, each one staring back at me with a frozen, suffocating intimacy that made my stomach churn. Some of them were familiar, pulled straight from my social media, but most of them weren't. They were pictures of me in places I had never been, angles that didn't make sense, moments that shouldn't exist, me sleeping in my bed, me brushing my hair in my bathroom, me sitting at my desk at work, looking directly into the camera, except I had never seen a camera there. My legs locked, my throat squeezed shut, and I turned in slow, jerky movements, my vision tunneling as I realized there was something else, something worse, something impossibly, sickeningly wrong. On the farthest wall, framed in cracked glass, hung a final picture, one I had never taken, one I had never posed for, one that sent a sharp, electric bolt of terror straight through my spine. It was a picture of me standing exactly where I was standing now. I don't remember backing away, don't remember the moment my body decided to move, don't remember turning on my heel and nearly tripping over myself in my desperation to put as much distance as possible between me and that picture, between me and the overwhelming, sickening wrongness of it all. But suddenly I was stumbling backward, my breath shuddering out in short, panicked gasps as my shoulder slammed into something solid, a mirror, tall and old, standing in the corner of the room like it had been waiting for me to notice it. My pulse roared in my ears as I turned, as I looked into the warped, dust-streaked glass, and at first everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as it could be, given the circumstances. My reflection was pale, wide-eyed, my chest rising and falling in uneven jerks, my lips parted around a breath I couldn't quite catch, but then as I took another step back, as I blinked, as my body trembled in the dim, suffocating light, my reflection didn't blink with me. A cold, sharp spike of terror shot through my spine, locking me in place, my mouth opening in a silent, disbelieving gasp as I stood there, motionless, my whole body screaming for me to run, to look away, to do anything but stand there and watch as my reflection slowly curled its lips into a smile that didn't belong to me. My legs felt weak, useless, but I forced them to move, forced myself to turn, to not see what I knew I would see if I looked back. But the second I moved, the air changed, the room shifted around me, something pressing in, something thick and heavy and ancient. And then from inside the mirror, from inside the glass, from inside the place where I should not have heard anything at all, a voice whispered my name. It wasn't loud, wasn't sharp or harsh or angry, but something about it was worse, something about it was familiar, something about the way it spoke, about the way it stretched each syllable like it had been waiting just for me. I don't know if I screamed, don't know if I made a sound at all, don't know how I managed to get my body to move. But somehow suddenly I was outside, suddenly I was in my car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely shove my keys into the ignition, my lungs burning, my entire body locked in panic. And yet, even as I peeled away from that house, even as I tore through empty streets, I couldn't bring myself to look into my rearview mirror because deep down in some raw animal part of me, that had finally caught up with what was happening. I already knew what I would see. I would see myself sitting in the back seat, smiling. I didn't go home, couldn't bring myself to walk into my apartment and see my reflection waiting for me in the darkened screen of my TV, in the bathroom mirror, in the glass of my windows, smiling that too wide, too knowing, too wrong smile, the one that still burned behind my eyelids every time I blinked. Instead I drove, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts, the world outside warping into a smear of streetlights and neon signs that didn't look real anymore, that looked stretched and distorted, like the edges of reality were fraying, unraveling, folding in on themselves. My phone buzzed beside me, but I didn't dare look at it, didn't dare reach for it, because I knew what name I would see flashing across the screen, knew that if I picked it up, if I put it to my ear, I would hear my own voice on the other end, whispering my name in that same slow, careful way the mirror had. Eventually, my car ended up in front of Natalie's apartment without me ever making the conscious decision to go there, my body working on autopilot, some desperate, instinctive need to be around something real, something normal, something that wasn't twisted and wrong and watching me from places it had no right to be. I barely remember running up the stairs, barely remember pounding on her door, but then she was there, blinking at me in confusion, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern the second she saw my face. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, breathless, my hands still shaking, my skin clammy and pale, but before she could even ask, before she could say anything, I was already inside, locking the door behind me, pressing my back against it like I expected something to follow me in. I tried to explain, tried to make sense of what had happened, tried to tell her about the house, about the pictures, about the mirror. But the words got stuck in my throat, tangled up in the raw electric terror still crawling beneath my skin. And when she grabbed my shoulders, when she forced me to look at her, the only thing I could manage to say was, "I don't think I'm alone." Natalie didn't laugh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't tell me I was being ridiculous, because something in my voice must have scared her, must have felt real enough to make her believe me, at least enough to sit me down, to hand me a glass of water, to let me catch my breath while she pressed me for details. But as I sat there, as I forced myself to breathe, as I finally, slowly, shakily reached for my phone to check the notifications I had ignored in my panic, the bottom dropped out of my stomach, my blood turning to ice, because my last received message wasn't from Daniel, wasn't from some unknown number, wasn't anything I could have ever prepared myself to see. It was from me. Sent at 3:13 a.m. A single 3-word text that shouldn't have been possible, that shouldn't exist, that sent a slow, creeping horror down my spine as I turned the screen toward Natalie, my voice barely more than a whisper when I read it aloud. "Let me in." Natalie stared at the screen, her face pale and unreadable, her lips slightly parted like she was about to say something, but the words never came, like she couldn't quite find a way to make sense of what she was seeing, like some part of her still wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, even though we both knew deep down that there wasn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the phone, my breath hitching in my throat as I scrolled through my message history, desperate to prove to myself that it had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of glitch, anything other than what I already knew it was. But there it was, sitting in my sent folder like I had typed it myself. "Let me in." Those 3 words staring back at me like a taunt, like a warning, like a door had already been opened and I hadn't even noticed. My mind raced, trying to remember where my phone had been, if I had left it anywhere, if someone could have taken it, used it, sent that message without me knowing, but the answer was already there, cold and suffocating in the back of my mind. No one had taken my phone because no one needed to. I told Natalie everything then, every single detail I had tried to downplay before, every moment that hadn't felt right, every strange coincidence, every whisper of unease that had been gnawing at me for weeks. And by the time I was finished, she wasn't looking at me like I was crazy anymore. She was looking at me like she was scared, like she finally understood that this wasn't just some creepy guy on the internet, wasn't just some elaborate catfish or some unhinged stalker, but something else. Entirely, something that shouldn't exist but did. We started searching then, started pulling at every thread we could find, anything that might explain what was happening, and that was when we found it, the name, the address, the obituary. My stomach twisted as I clicked the link, as the screen filled with the familiar face I had stared at for weeks, the face I had come to know so well, the face that was supposed to belong to a man who was still alive, still breathing, still texting me even now, but the article told a different story, a story I didn't want to believe. Daniel Whitaker, 28, died in a house fire 5 years ago. The air in the room went still, heavy, pressing against my skin like something was suffocating me from the inside. Like the walls had grown smaller. Like something had shifted around us the moment we read those words. Like we had just crossed some invisible threshold that we were never supposed to find. My pulse pounded in my ears as I clicked through old news reports, as I scanned through pictures of the burned-out house, the same house I had stood in less than 24 hours ago, the same house that was supposed to be long gone, reduced to ash and rubble, not standing there waiting for me like it had never been touched. I barely registered Natalie grabbing my arm, barely heard the way her voice shook when she whispered my name because my phone buzzed again, and when I looked down, when I saw the notification, when I saw his name, when I saw the words staring back at me from the glowing screen, I felt my breath catch in my throat, my vision tunneling, my entire body locking up as I read his message. "You were the only one who kept looking for me. That means you're mine now." I don't remember dropping my phone, don't remember the way it hit the floor with a dull, lifeless thud, don't remember the way Natalie scrambled to pick it up, her fingers shaking as she scanned the message, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, like she needed to say something, but what was there left to say? My pulse was a war drum in my ears, pounding so hard I thought my skull might crack under the pressure, my vision tunneling, the edges of the room growing darker, stretching outward like the walls weren't solid anymore. Like the space around us had shifted, twisted, warped into something else entirely. I tried to breathe, tried to ground myself, tried to force my mind to latch onto something real, something tangible, something that wasn't the impossible truth staring back at me from the screen, but it was already too late. The second I blinked, the second my eyelids dragged shut for even a fraction of a second, I felt it. A presence, a shift, something settling into my skin, into my bones, something that wasn't me, but was inside me anyway. Natalie must have seen the change before I even felt it, must have caught whatever unnatural, wrong thing had crept into my expression, because her face twisted, her breath hitching, her fingers digging into my arms like she was trying to hold me in place, like she thought she could physically keep me from slipping away. But the second I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her I was still here, still me, I heard another voice, my voice, speaking at the same time, overlapping, tangled and discordant and wrong. My chest seized, a sharp, splitting pain blooming beneath my ribs like something was pulling me apart from the inside, unraveling me thread by thread, making room for something else, something that had been waiting, something that had been there all along, whispering from the darkness, from the glass, from the spaces in between. I tried to move, but my limbs didn't feel like mine, my fingers twitching, curling, responding to something else, something watching, something waiting, something smiling through my reflection. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The pressure lifted, the pain evaporated, the air cleared, and for a single terrible moment I thought maybe it was over. But when I met Natalie's wide, unblinking stare, when I felt the breath leave her lungs in a slow, shuddering exhale, when I saw the fear rooted so deeply in her face that she couldn't even bring herself to move, I knew. I forced myself to look down at my hands, forced myself to take inventory of my body, of my limbs, of the slow, unnatural stillness that had settled over me. And then finally I forced myself to lift my head, to turn, to face the hallway mirror. And that was when I saw it, the thing that should have been my reflection but wasn't. It looked like me, stood like me, wore my face, but it wasn't me. Not anymore. It grinned, slow and deliberate, head tilting at an unnatural angle, and as I watched, as my own lips stretched into a smile I didn't choose, a whisper slithered through the room, curling in the air between us, my own voice crawling back into my ears from a mouth I no longer controlled. You finally let me in. I wanted to scream, wanted to move, wanted to do anything other than just stand there, locked in place, watching my own reflection grin back at me with someone else's hunger, with someone else's delight, but my body didn't belong to me anymore. My limbs heavy, unresponsive, like something else had settled inside my skin, like I was trapped beneath it, buried alive inside myself. The worst part, the thing that sent a deep, gnawing terror sinking into my bones, was that I could still feel everything, could still feel the muscles in my face stretch as the thing inside me forced my lips into a smile, could still feel the cold press of the floor against my feet as it stepped forward, my body moving without my permission, closing the distance between myself and the mirror in slow, measured strides. Behind me, Natalie let out a sharp, panicked breath, barely a sound at all, but I heard it, God, I heard it, and so did the thing in the mirror because my head tilted, my eyes slid sideways toward her, and my voice that was no longer mine, spilled from my lips in a soft, lilting murmur that made my stomach turn. She sees me now. Natalie moved before I could stop her, before I could warn her, before I could force my stolen body to do anything other than watch as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass candle holder from the coffee table, and without hesitation, without thinking, she smashed it into the mirror with everything she had. The world seemed to shatter with it, a piercing, unnatural shriek splitting the air. Not from me, not from her, but from inside the glass, from the thing that had been waiting there, watching, hiding just beneath the surface. For a fraction of a second I felt my body jerk, felt the force of something being yanked backward like an invisible thread had snapped, like something had been severed in the impact, and then suddenly all at once I was back. My knees buckled, my hands scraped against broken shards as I collapsed to the floor, gasping like I had just surfaced from drowning, my vision swimming, my breath ragged and shallow. The silence that followed was so sharp, so suffocating that for a moment, I thought we had won, that it was over, that whatever had crawled into me had died with the mirror. But then as I lifted my head, as I looked up at the jagged shards scattered across the floor, I saw it, the reflection staring back at me from a piece of broken glass, grinning, untouched, alive. And then the house began to shake. The walls groaned, the floor trembled beneath me, the light overhead flickering like something big, something unseen, something ancient had just realized what we had done. Natalie grabbed me, her hands under my arms, yanking me up, her voice sharp, desperate, telling me to move, to run, to get out, and this time I listened. We didn't look back as we tore through the apartment, didn't look at the mirrors, at the windows, at the places where our reflections should have been, because we already knew, that they weren't ours anymore. The moment we burst through the front door, the moment we hit the cold night air, I heard it one last time, felt it crawl down my spine in a whisper that I would never forget. A voice I would never unhear, a promise from the dark, from the glass, from the thing that had not been destroyed but had only just begun. I'll find you again. I don't know how long Natalie and I drove that night, don't know how many miles we put between ourselves and the apartment, don't know how many red lights we ran in our blind, desperate need to get away, to keep moving, to put something, anything, between us and whatever had been in that mirror, in my body, in the house, waiting, watching, whispering. Neither of us spoke, neither of us dared to, because there was nothing left to say, because speaking would make it real, would force us to acknowledge that none of this was over, that no matter how far we ran, no matter how many times we checked the mirrors, no matter how many times I told myself I was me again, some part of me still wasn't sure. My hands felt wrong on the wheel, my breath felt foreign in my own lungs, my reflection in the side window seemed just a fraction slower than it should have been, a half second too late, a beat off rhythm, a delay I couldn't ignore. But I didn't look directly at it, didn't dare turn my head, didn't let myself think about what might be looking back, because deep down, in that primal part of my mind that had been screaming since the moment I stepped into that house, I already knew it wasn't over. Eventually, we ended up at some rundown motel on the outskirts of nowhere. A place with flickering neon and a clerk who didn't ask questions, who handed over a key with a bored, disinterested glance, as if he had seen worse things than two women shaking out of their skin, looking over their shoulders like something was about to crawl through the door behind them. I locked the room up tight, covered the mirror in the bathroom with a towel, shoved the dresser in front of the window, anything to keep the outside out, anything to make myself believe we were safe, that whatever had been reaching for me from inside the glass was gone. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many times I told myself I was just being paranoid, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed, that something was still waiting. Sleep didn't come, couldn't come, and at some point in the middle of the night, when the exhaustion became unbearable, when my body couldn't fight the weight of it any longer, I reached for my phone out of habit, needing something, anything, to distract myself from the cold, creeping dread that had settled deep inside me. But the second I turned on the screen, I felt the blood drain from my face, my stomach turning to ice. The time was 3:13 a.m. The phone buzzed once, a single notification flashing across the screen. A message with no sender, no name, just words, just a whisper. Just a reminder that I had never really escaped at all. My breath hitched, my heart slamming against my ribs, my vision tunneling as I read the words over and over again. My fingers tightening around the phone so hard I thought the screen might crack beneath them. You can't unmatch me. And then as I stared, as I sat there frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, the lock screen flickered, the image warping, shifting, twisting into something I had seen before, something I had tried so hard to forget. It was the house that had burned down 5 years ago, the house that shouldn't exist, the house where it all began. And standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim glow of the phone screen, was Daniel. But this time he wasn't smiling. This time he was waiting.